वरना गन माइक या कुछ लगा सही में, ऑडियो ना बहुत इसका एक ज़्यादा किया है।
तो कहाँ पे लगा रखा है?
दोनों में रखा है एम्बियंस।
आज कैमरा भाई वो तो वही खा ठीक दे दिया ना, इधर का वेट ले भूखा है तो पॉजिटिव तो पकड़ना वाला
write and tell stories, their stories and other people's stories on partition, both sides of the fence. And then Rafael is an environmental, I'm about to say environmental lawyer and a cyclist. And he has actually a story in the collection, which is Dan talking about his story as well as everybody else's story, all stories. It just happens that all of them have a partition history, except I don't have any. My family is stuck in the same place more or less, and there was no movement or then correct me if I'm wrong. We don't have the same strong and you're now in Delhi.
रोज चला दिया था कुछ चला था
प्रमोट कर दिए थे, कट प्रमोट कर दिए थे।
196 मिनट दिखा रहा था।
196
222 का होता है ना।
हाँ
चल रहे हैं। दूसरा वाला को ये करते हैं, इसके बाद अपना ये कर लेते हैं दूसरा वाला।
This is a sort of a subject which is serious. This is a subject which people keep talking about, but somehow it sort of becomes a sort of thing of history. So I think the word partition itself has changed over the years. I mean, how we deal with the word partition. For instance, for my
ऑडियो दादा, ऑडियो खत्म है। हाँ वो करना पड़ेगा कुछ ना कुछ, ऑडियो से खत्म।
like emergency or apple pie or even liberalization for a later generation. The word partition, like these other words, existed in dictionaries before and after. But they became proper nouns, sort of capitalized, mark a period or a certain sort of period in history. And yet there's a sort of irony, I think, as partition with a sort of lowercase p, even as it was happening or it was sort of construed decades, a few decades after the actual event, became partition with a sort of capital P. So even as it turned from a sort of reality, flesh and blood reality in color, a very bloody and very sort of distraught reality, to a historical, sociological, statistical kind of sepia tone sort of partition. I think for a lot of us, the word partition sort of became drained of its magnitude, drained of its exceptionalism, and most obviously drained of its horrors, or at least it sort of was, some of them end up facing the horrors or remembering the horrors. That's the word remembrance is critical here, or the lack of. The largest mass migration in human history, with some 12 million people relocated over a few months and about 1 million killed. That being drained of its scale and tragic sort of force by obviously time. But then there's this overwhelming sort of celebration of a day, which is the 14th of August in Pakistan and the 15th of August in India. And yet when talking about sort of re-imaging partition, one I think has to talk about the other partition. Not only the partition of India, but also the partition of
system
Pakistan,
current
the partition of Kashmir.
sorry equipment
Because the real story of partitions is about people being sort of forced out of their homes, being killed and killing people because their identities are perceived not to match their own. Then how different is a partition of a country from the utter tragedies of, say, the 1983 massacre of Bengali Muslims in Bangladesh and Delhi, Assam, the 1984 killings of Sikhs in Delhi, the almost decades-long exodus of Pandits from Kashmir Valley through the mid-90s, the intercommunal riots across parts of India in 1993 post-Babri Masjid demolition, the 2002 anti-Muslim riots in Gujarat, the ethnic killings and displacement of almost 4 lakh people in Assam in 2012, and the refugee camp that's been there. So I'm going to ask all of you, panelists here, and Muzaffarnagar. So I want to ask sort of a rhetorical question to start with. So why, if there are so many of these sort of mini partitions, these sort of violent sort of episodes that we can forget in a rush, why should we remember partitions? Why should we remember partitions? Why is it necessary to remember the horror?
Very little.
Louder, we can't hear it.
Yeah.
I don't think it's an either or thing. Why should we remember partition when there is so much else that's going on? I think one of the tragedies of not talking about partition and not understanding what it has meant in our lives and not being willing to confront it has meant that we are unwilling to confront all its consequences, many of which are the sort of things you're talking about, not necessarily directly, but the legacies of violence that our countries, our three countries have had to deal with in the past 66 years. And in some way, just as partition did, but on a much grander scale. So also, all of these moments in our history that you're talking about, somewhere disrupt the narrative of the wonderful nations that we have got. And therefore, we should want to actually talk a lot about that. And I think it's very necessary to remember partition so that we can. Thank you, Mani. Thank you, KLF. So we don't have to scream. So
that's right.
I think it's very necessary to remember partition so that we can not only deal with its consequences, but we can see how it plays out in our lives today. And we can also ensure that something like that does not happen in the future, although there is no guarantee of that. But one of the ways in which we avoid confronting our violent pasts is, and looking at our complicity in them, and partition is particularly necessary to remember because in partition there are no clear good guys and bad guys. Both Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs were complicit in what happened in the violence. They were both victims and aggressors. And then there are many ways in which this history plays out, not only in the lives of the majorities who were involved in it, but in the lives of all the others, the minority communities, the people who were geographically elsewhere, the second generation and the third generation down. And I think for all of those reasons,
This is a past that lives inside us, inside our families, and yet in our mainstream narratives, we don't recognize how deeply it lives inside us and how much it remains unresolved.
Vishnu, you want to
For me, I think what you said, partition is not with a capital P, it's with a small p with 3 dots in the end. Because for me, it's a continuing legacy. And I do not mean in terms of the ethnic riots that have followed, but I mean as a way of living. You know, if you've grown up in Delhi or Lahore or Dhaka, you know, moment you would say, you know, my grandfather said that in their house, you knew what the rest of the narrative is. You know? So we have lived our partition stories and we are still living them. It manifests itself in many ways in our kitchens. Oh, Lahori ka khana aisa banate hain, Multani khana aisa banate hain. You know, there are many ways we deal with partition, and the thrust of this book was not about the generation that suffered it, but the generations that processed it and lived through it. In the sense, how did they retell or how did they deal with it? Because it's a piece of history, the grandfather is now a picture on the wall. How do we deal with partition? How do we deal with history? And I definitely feel, as Urvashi said, that, you know, these stories have to be told and retold, because for me, every partition story is eventually a translation. You know, it's always a retelling. So, in that sense, they have to be retold and they have to be remembered. I mean, रोएंगे हम 1000 बार, कोई फिर रुलाएगा, you know, it's like that. So, for me, it's important to remember these stories and retell the stories in our own ways. Now, for example, Rafe has a story in this book. It's about the Delhi family that moved to Lahore and the Lahoris who moved to Delhi, and then the third generation. I'm not being a teaser here, no, but you know, I got the two guys, the Delhiite and the Lahori, to collaborate on this story. And what you see in this book is only one version, because the other version the Delhiite gave me was completely different. So, it's the same story. It's a Rashomon. Partition for me is a Rashomon. The footage is the same, the edit keeps changing.
you want to tell your story yourself? And maybe before that, sure.
I have a partition story, and I was born decades after the event. When I was an undergraduate student at London, I had the great fortune of meeting one of my first Indian friends, actually. And this just goes to show the difficulty between communicating between India and Pakistan. And this is not too long ago, this is 15, 20 years ago. And the world has changed significantly since then. We discovered that, you know, his great-grandparents had lived in Lahore, mine lived there now, and so, you know, a series of questions went on. Okay, where do you live? We lived on the same street and roughly the same area. And a day or so later, he showed up in my room demanding rent because he discovered that I live in his great-grandfather's house. And that is what had happened.
Trust a Delhiite.
I don't know, I'm a lawyer, I'll see him in court. But that's what had happened. Bhavanatha Singh's family had gone to, I think, Simla over the summer of 1947. And Martin's grandmother, who was still alive then, a great old lady, told me she'd won the Gymkhana Club Women's Lawn Tennis Championship 3 years in a row in 47, in June 47. And they'd asked her to take the trophy home, and she said, no, let me win it 5 times, and then I'll take it home. So by June 47, this family had no idea what was going on. They went to Simla, then the violence started, and then one of the male family members came to Lahore, got their things, and with the help of Khushwant Singh, no less, managed to cross the border. And that was the last time the family was in Lahore. My family, my grandfather was working for a company in Delhi that had an office in Lahore. They just thought it would be smarter to have the Musliman work in the new Muslim country. And so that's how he got shifted. And eventually, as part of the evacuee pool, Lord Bhavanatha Singh's house allotted to him. And that's our little story. And when I discovered this about Martin and myself, it seemed odd that we had a partition story, but it was one about friendship and connection. So it appears that 50 years, 60 years after the event, with new generations not having experienced the event itself, the new generations will have ample opportunity to find their own partition stories that need not carry the old narrative at all. I work with a group in Pakistan called the Citizens Archive, and they collect video footage and archival material from generations who survived partition onwards. And it's a fascinating experience to see everyone's perceptions recorded and everyone's perceptions 60 years after the event. And I think that's the important thing. It's how we learn from the trauma. Like any trauma, there's those 4 or 5 stages of trauma that you go through. Eventually you come to a point of acceptance, and that's really where we need to be able to see each other once again without the violence, without the loss, without the partition, with a capital P or without.
I just have one query to Urvashi. I mean, obviously there's not one kind of telling the partition story. But in your book, The Other Side of Silence, it's not so much the anecdotals, it's actually sort of the brutal retellings, which probably a lot of people were not going to talk about because it's so sort of brutal by itself. And I just want you to share with the sort of audience here, A, what made you want to, for the lack of any other word, sort of dredge it out again, and B, how difficult was it? And the last one is, that book came out in '98. It's been 15 years, 16 years. What do you think that an updated version would be at this point?
Okay, my family has a partition history. Some of you who might have read my work might be familiar with it, so forgive me for repeating it. But briefly, it was that my mother's family was from Lahore, and at partition, just before partition, they moved to what became India. But my mother's brother stayed behind in Lahore and retained the family house and kept my grandmother back. So my mother and her siblings never saw their mother again, never knew when she had died. They were never able to go back to Pakistan, and they did not receive any compensation on this side. And then my uncle, my mother's brother, converted to Islam and married a Muslim woman. So there was, even though my family is not particularly religious, there were lots of betrayals that informed this experience of profound cleavage, even if there was no physical violence involved. And for years in my family, we grew up with this history without paying much attention to it, because we just thought these were old people's stories. My mother always went on about her brother and her mother and so on. It was in 1984 in Delhi, and one of the moments in our history that Indi talked about, when Indira Gandhi was killed and the Sikhs in Delhi were targeted in an orgy of revenge because she was killed by her Sikh bodyguards. My family is originally Sikh, although we don't look like it, because my father by then lost all his hair, so he wasn't any longer wearing a turban. But suddenly, this city that I had known all my life as a safe, secular city transformed itself into a violent space, and there were no real certainties anymore. I worked with a large group of people that was set up, a citizens group called Nagrik Ekta Manch, to help the victims of that violence. And my job was in one of the areas to take down people's testimonies so that we could file for compensation claims and so on. And it was in taking down those testimonies that I began to hear references to partition again. And that really shook me, because I thought that if 5 days in Delhi had done this, what must that violence have been like, and why was it that I, who had lived with this history all my life, had paid no attention to it? And I decided to look into the history, and the first thing that I did was to go to Pakistan and find my uncle and start talking to him. And you made a reference to Rashomon. The Rashomon-like story was so different. My mother's version of it was so different. His version of it was so different that it revealed to me that even where there had been no violence, there had been such profound divisions that we really needed to look at the history. And then I started on a 10-year-long journey, talking to people and going from story to story and finding out things that I had not even imagined. I'm ashamed to say it, I'm a feminist. I should have known. I had no idea of the scale of rape stories that had taken place during partition. And it was going into them, exploring them, that led me to understand the scale and the difficulty of talking about it and the need for silence on the part of women who had lived through it. It's a big thing. I'm not going to go all into that. Now, your question about 10, 15 years later, how would I look at that history? I think what has happened is there are moments in the histories of countries, of nations, where certain historical explorations become both possible and necessary. And I think for various reasons it has become possible and necessary for those of us in South Asia to start exploring our violent past, which is why you see in the last 15 years so much more work and so much new work and so much nuanced and different work on partition and on trying to understand partition. So I think while at that moment it was important to record the histories of people who had lived through that time, now it's important to go much deeper into those histories and see the layers and the nuances which are less talked about. I mean, for example, and my own work is guilty of this, even though I looked at the history of Dalits and children and women, but broadly speaking the narrative was about Hindu, Muslim and Sikh.
Right.
What happened to the Christians? What happened to the minorities? What happened to the second generations? What happened to the Sindhis?
Yeah.
You know, one needs to look at all of these things. So I think partition histories now would be doing that kind of thing.
Right. Vishwa, in terms of the other side of where the partition story sort of happened, which is, we're talking about East Pakistan, your story sort of deals with your grandmother talking about, you know, camps in Madhya Pradesh. I mean, one thing is, relatively, would you agree that there is a less sort of knowledge about what happened on the eastern side in 47, in terms of, you know, either sort of people knowing about it or people even sort of doing sort of research about it?
Well, I would say it's not less known. I mean, this is less discussed in this side of the country.
Okay.
I mean, there's a lot of work that's been done in Bengali literature on partition stories.
Right.
There's a lot of non-fiction work, seminal being Jashodhara Bagchi's
Of course.
Trauma and Triumph. Devjani Sengupta, who's an academic in Delhi, gave me a very beautiful story. It's when the East Bengalis came into Calcutta, it's for the first time in the lower middle class houses, women started going out and working. And they were called Colony May, which basically means the colony girls. And that became a substrata of the society on which the films like Mahanagar or Meghe Dhaka Tara are broadly based.
Right.
Now, that is a very small little narrative in the larger great grandeur of Calcutta. But to think about it, I mean, there's a whole lot of stories that came out from that section itself.
Sure.
What is not got discussed very widely are the camps in central India and the Marid Chapi massacre that happened in Bengal, and the sad fact that there are still refugee camps of the 47 burden still existing in West Bengal. Those guys still have this certain hope that, you know, they will get, you know, facilitated within the state, but they're still on a rented piece of land. So for me, it was interesting because I grew up in this refugee home in Delhi called Kasturba Niketan, which was basically for the widows of both the West and the East. And my grandmother was an officer there, and she was asked to go to the Dandakaranya camp. Now, Dandakaranya is now known for different reasons, but in the 70s it was known for the Bengali refugee camps there. The riverine population of Bangladesh was put into the central landlocked Madhya Pradesh camps, where they were told, stay or perish. So there was this government policy that happened that the officers were sent from Delhi to get the children who would be given education and everything, but they will not be allowed to meet their parents or go back to their mothers for 15 years. So my grandmother's job was to be an agent of the state, tell them the great Indian dream waiting for their kids, and not tell them the fact that their dole will be cut because the children are getting separated, and the fact that they will not be able to meet them. So that was another partition. But what really stumped her was when two women stood up and said, you take them, we don't want to meet them, at least they will make something out of their lives.
That's right.
So for me, those narratives are equally important, and the partition narrative, because those narratives have completely got lost. I mean, for me, the revelation working on this book was to go and meet the inmates who have now become land-holding giants of Lajpat Nagar. It's the fate of Lajpat Nagar to be a refugee colony forever. Because what has happened in Kasturba Niketan per se is that they were on a government land. After years of negotiation, they have bought the land as small little plots that have been divided, and they have made their 60 Gaj square yards little buildings. They are now renting it out to the Afghani medical tourists in dollars. And the rents are as comparable, for those of you who know Delhi, are as comparable as GK2.
Alright, wow.
In dollars. And I am looking at my grandmother used to tell you to have a better life, you know, do something with your life, send your school to children. And I mean, man, I could be, you know. So for me, these are the interesting parts of the partition which are still continuing. So.
Narrative on 1971. We don't call it partition. We call it the separation of Bangladesh. How a majority province can do that is anyone's logical guess. But you know, what I wanted to say is that this partition word has a particular legal root. And forgive me because I'm a lawyer, I'm going to make a reference. But I think that we have to make it, I want to make a distinction between mass migrations and sometimes the violence that occurs in our part of the world with mass migrations. We have examples of the Afghan war and millions of Afghan refugees coming to Pakistan. We also have the example in 2009 of a military operation taking place in northern parts of Pakistan and 1.5 million people being displaced. That was one of the largest displacements in history as well. But no large-scale violence. What interests me about the violence of partition, or indeed the violence following Indira Gandhi's assassination, is how quickly it erupted and how vicious it was. Because clearly something touched a nerve. Now, partition itself comes from the land, legally comes from the Land Acquisition Act, which was a British colonial law. We have to understand that the British were the first bunch of people that gave Indians the ability to transfer property, to hold and transfer property with the Transfer of Property Act. Before that, if you had land, very few people actually owned land. And even if you owned land, the ability to transfer it was limited by whatever area you were living in. So this idea that the British had brought property rights to this part of the world, where property rights meant on the ladder, you had a connection with the divinity that you had property. And Zan Zar Zameen, jo Punjab ki hai, land, honor and women, they were all encompassed into this concept of property. Partitioning is the division of land. And it's a very modern technique brought by a modern legal system and applied to a very old concept of ownership. I think that perhaps could be a point that flares. Because there is a distinction, I think, especially in Punjab, between modernism that the English brought with the canals and the railways and the universities, and the old Punjab, the old villages that didn't have straight roads, that came out of this clan-based associations and things. So there is an old and new.
Which you're talking about in terms of the Afghan thing also.
Yeah, also
fits in. Yeah.
But partition itself, I think, if you peel it back, was the large-scale division of land on a scale that had never happened before in a part of the world that held land very, very dear. So maybe there's we can find more about this or about partition by looking into this. And here I'd like to add one more thing. I don't think the partition of India and Pakistan was in any way complete in 1947. That was a political line drawn by an Englishman who had a census information that was perhaps 10 years old. But that was just the land. Land and water come together. The partition of water in South Asia took place with the Indus Water Treaty in 1960. So in many ways, we must look at partition as a two-stage process.
And no one's really thought about what we've done to the three rivers, the eastern rivers, by drying them up on the Pakistani side. You know, Oliver Wendell Holmes said a river is not a resource, it's a treasure. So when we better understand our ecological history, we will better understand what we've done in partition now.
Right.
So partition ki understanding will continue for years, and hopefully younger generations will be able to translate it differently. This is not to say to forget the violence or to lose respect from learning of that violence.
It's not either or.
We digest it and we move onwards.
Sure, please.
I just wanted to add that this overlaying this is a whole range of other things that we also need to understand. Cultural things which in many ways obtained between the stereotypes of Hindus and Muslims. Certainly in Punjab, the fact that the Hindus were the landowners, the Muslims were the poor cultivators, the Muslim peasant was the most indebted peasant in history in the subcontinent, and how those relations were reversed in UP, where you get Muslim landholders and Hindu peasants. And then you see in the large-scale abduction of women that took place, how land played a really major role, because especially many Muslim women who inherited or whose parents might have died, and I have heard several stories like this, were forcibly taken back to be married off to the X or Y member in the family who had claim to the other part of the adjoining land. So all of these things really underlie that. And I want to, just because you mentioned Radcliffe, who is the man who actually drew the boundary line, and to tell you a little story on the Bangladesh side of the border. I was once visiting a small village called Belu, I forget exactly the name, but on the border, and this was before the border had become quite rigid, and all the children in the village and every person in the village knows the name of Radcliffe. So they point out to you saying, look how crazy this border is, that tree is in Bangladesh, this stone is in India, and so on. And then they say, there was this madman called Radcliffe. And he came here and he was given the task of drawing the boundary, and he didn't know what to do. So all night long he got drunk. He kept drinking, and all the kids tell you this. And then they say in the morning they handed him a pen, and he couldn't draw straight. So he went like this, like this, like this, and we have to live with the consequences.
It's a sort of variation of the Tobati story in a weird way. Just sort of briefly coming back to the 71 business. I mean, you've sort of followed it because you went to Bangladesh not too long ago. We have discussed about the Shahbag thing. Now that's a sort of living. I mean, it's less theoretical for instance, Bangladesh about what happened in 71. The whole business of people, the Shahbag movement was to find what they think is a sort of collaborators and getting justice, getting closure. How do we should think that at some level this the 71 story for Bangladesh sort of subsumes the 47 story, and if there's any other sort of thing you want to talk about in terms of the 71, the partition, the separation, whatever.
For a lot of the Bengali families, and I'm not here representing the Bengali families, but I know for a lot of Bengali families who have nothing to do with Bangladesh, who are living perfectly well in Delhi, it's still a part of the narrative. Because I remember one afternoon my mother came back from office and we were in the market and my grandmother was with us, and she came straight into the market and she told her mom, Ma, Ziaur Rahman's been shot dead. Now that's got nothing to do with her immediate politics, but the fact that something has happened in Bangladesh was still concerning them. One of the stories that we have in this book is about this family that's a Bengali family that's moving from Karachi, living in Karachi, and then they realize that Pakistan has now been split into two countries, and now that they are foreigners in Karachi. And it's a scheme that they are hatching to migrate from Pakistan via Quetta, India, and then over to Bangladesh, their promised land. So they are consistently, they are always fearing the fact that they will be put into refugee camps tomorrow. They are privileged families and they didn't want to do it. So, in many ways, the 71 partition was a bigger dhakka for the people of these two countries, because they didn't know really how to deal with it, because it was a completely partition of a different kind with another foreign land in the middle. So it was not, there was a via media. And how sympathetic was the via media was for nobody to guess. I met this driver in Dhaka when I was going, I've been to Dhaka 15 times. So for the 16th time when I went, I met this driver who was a real shrewd, smart guy. He lived for all his working years in Karachi, a full Bengali, and when the split happened, he converted into a Pakistani citizenship because he said, this is where my bread and butter is.
Sure.
But he kept his relations with his village in Bangladesh, and he would travel there once a year on a tourist visa, and he kept sure that his land is fine. Now, he worked through his years in Karachi, made his money, built another house in his village in Bangladesh, and the day he retired, he left that and became a Bangladeshi citizen. Okay. So I think there was a smart guy who was negotiating partition, and I've never heard a Bengali speaking Urdu in a Bengali accent. I've never heard Bengali speaking Urdu, but you know, Urdu in a Bengali accent can be a very cute thing.
Well, it's as valid as you know,
As your Urdu, yeah.
as my Urdu, yeah.
But you know, this is the way a lot of the second and the third generation has negotiated partition, especially in these two countries, because the second generation is the one that's been I think the biggest in denial.
Okay.
You know, because they have been too busy making sense out of their own lives and hearing their parents' stories in many ways.
But is that sort of unnatural, or I mean?
No, that has manifested itself in the third generation, especially in Bangladesh, because when I was chasing a lot of the young authors in Bangladesh, they said, you know, I was not born during the war and I wouldn't know anything about partition. So for them, 71 is the point, and nothing before that happened. You know, so it's like the partitioning of our memories.
Fair enough.
You know, and for us, those have become the timelines. You know, a lot of the people I met in Lahore, nothing begins before 47. You know, we were playing cards, and this guy trumped over me, and he said, "Oh, this is for the Victory Day, 65."
Right.
So I said, "What happened in the Victory Day, 65?" He said, "We won." I said, "I am told we won."
Okay, yeah.
So this we won, who won went on for a while, and we realized we are playing a Rashomon here.
Yeah.
You know, so I think the 65 and 71 are very seminal points of the other partition, because India did not deal with it directly, but dealt with it in many other ways, I mean, which we are still living with. Yeah.
Sure. Rafael, you want to comment on? I think you earlier sort of were mentioning the definition of partition, but I just wanted you to say something about what you think in terms of 71, really.
Absolutely. I was on the panel yesterday, and someone brought the question up of 71. It was answered much better by Anis Ahmed than myself. But I mean, I'm very sensitive to the fact that the Pakistani state has a total domination on the narrative. It took me 16, 17 years, and I was very lucky to be able to study abroad, which is actually the first time I found literature about 1971. I had to go to another country. And it was very difficult learning that, well, we may not have won 65, for example. And also what happened in 1971. And there's still a resistance in Pakistan to facing what happened between March 71 and December 71. Most recently, there was an execution in Bangladesh that triggered a nerve in Pakistan that was incomprehensible.
Okay.
Sat there trying to figure out why my National Assembly has passed a resolution about someone who quite clearly is a war criminal.
Right.
Why is this still something that gets people so riled up? And who are the people getting riled up as well?
I think, I mean, even in India, there was a certain amount of confoundment and sort of, why is this happening? And yet, we were not technically in the party, if you know what I mean. So.
All right, here I'm going to, because we're very good at conspiracy theories,
Yeah.
I'm going to try and pass one out.
Yeah.
Vishwa accused me of being a gossip yesterday.
It's also called oral history, according to everyone.
Okay.
So
that's what you call it nowadays, oral history. It seemed to me that there, in the execution of this war criminal, there was quite clear complicity of the Pakistan army.
Okay.
and then some usual suspects shoot out on social media and in the news. The usual suspects who support this view, making very aggressive claims about what happened and what didn't happen. And I think that's what's still going on. There is still an element of denial in the security establishment and indeed the Pakistani establishment about what happened. And the more people in Pakistan push with the new tools that we have at our hands, photographs, YouTube, now the internet, you can circulate things much more quickly, that we've got to, for our part, push back and show people what actually happened, to make that admission, to make that understanding, to make that apology. I'll say Pakistan owes an apology to Bangladesh, which is yet forthcoming.
I just want to draw your attention, because we are talking about 47 and 71, the two histories, to something which is also really another very rich theme of history to explore, and which the exploration has begun, but it hasn't been looked at in full. If you look at 47 and the mass rape of women during 47, and you look at how it was socially dealt with at the level of ordinary people, and it was dealt with by the states. Both the Indian and Pakistani states felt very responsible for what had happened to the women, and in the midst of fighting with each other over every pencil, every gun, every ammunition depot, and so on and so forth, they got together and formulated a policy of how to, within quotes, deal with the crisis of what had happened to their women. And in doing so, felt that they had adopted a moral stance, expressing their responsibility as a caring, patriarchal, benevolent state towards its citizens, i.e. women. Then you look at 71 and you see the mass rape of women in 71, and the way in which the Bangladeshi state dealt with that over a period of time, even creating a name for the women, Birangana, and actually taking them into account as national heroes, or as people whose lives had been deeply impacted by what had gone on, but refusing to recognize them, because the narrative of rape is a very disruptive narrative in the narrative of the nation coming into its own. So refusing to recognize them in the war museum that has subsequently been set up, except for including one letter by a father about his daughter who was raped. But otherwise there is no reference, there's a refusal, there's a difficulty of how to deal with it. And then you look at the three states now, but particularly at India now, and the discourse and discussion that has been going on about the violation of women's bodies, rape, sexual assault, and so on and so forth, and how the state is dealing with that as well. I mean, I think there is a way in which in our histories we need to explore this and see the different ways in which the state has related, the people have related to it, women's movements have responded to it. It's something that still remains to be talked about.
May I just add to that, and Urvashi, that might just help in your coming book. This is a story that I wanted to use in this book, I couldn't. I met this lady, I came across this lady online. She's 80 plus now. When the 47 thing happened, Lady Mountbatten had put up a trauma center in Delhi to help the rape survivors and the tortured women. And they could not find a counselor to counsel these women. So they got hold of this young girl who was just a second-year psychology student in Lady Irwin. And they said, okay, you've done psychology? Counsel them. And the girl was just 18, 19, too young to handle this. And she narrated the story that she went there for 2 days and 3 days, and on the 4th day she took a bus to the Rashtrapati Bhavan, met Lady Mountbatten, cried on her shoulders and said, I can't do this. You know, I think these are the missing narratives. I wish we could use that story, but you know, these are the missing narratives of the people who were trying to help the other way, which I think are as important in the show.
Absolutely. I'm going to open up for questions, but I just want to sort of ask one last question to the panel here. I mean, somehow, unlike, Urvashi mentioned there are no sort of clear good guys and bad guys, so that might be one reason, but there is no partition museum in, at least in India and in Pakistan, as far as I know. Bangladesh sort of has one, but it's sort of. Is that an issue? Is that, I mean, there are many kinds of remembering, as we discussed. I think one sort of popular way, which I think nowadays partition stories are being told much more easier than, let's say, an academic version. I would say graphic novels, for instance, or even like movies. Or my question is, why is there no partition museum, and is there a need to have one? And I'll ask all three, and then I'll open it up to the audience.
Well, of course there's a need for a partition museum. There have been attempts in Lahore to create a partition museum, but they've been met with lack of funds and the general sort of inefficiency we expect of bureaucracies. That's unfortunate. The Citizens Archive of Pakistan is working towards an archive museum where we will put this, we have over 15,000 interviews and over 80,000 documents now that we can put into an archive and into a museum. And we're working towards it. We'll see if the private sector will do what the public sector doesn't. But it's very important to have this. I mean, I tell you, it wasn't until the internet that I saw my first reel of Muhammad Ali Jinnah walking and moving. It wasn't until the internet that I had the ability to do that. So these are things that we need to teach people much sooner, so that they understand much better, much quicker.
Yeah, I think there's a need to go beyond the museum. I think there's a need to memorialize that history. And even, for example, you take Delhi, Humayun's tomb, Purana Killa, these were places where there were the biggest refugee camps, and there is not even a plaque that reminds you of that history. The question also comes up, what kind of museum you will have, because if you have a state museum, the memory will be very selective. If you have a private museum, money is a problem. Also, but it's very necessary. In addition to the Citizens Archive of Pakistan, there is an online archive which has been set up by some individuals, and they have now collected some 3,000 plus stories and photographs and so on. So there are some initiatives.
Right. Okay. Quickly.
Yeah, even I'm not very sure about this nature of this museum, because I think we need more intense dialogues just across. I think that is a living museum. I mean, you know, using graphic novels as a form for me is interesting, because I mean, young kids deal with it, they negotiate with it, they read it, they also write it, because I think for a nascent form like graphic novels, it's important to have new readers and convert the literary readers into graphic novel readers. But for that, we also need new writers. And you know, the term, when I was asking Martin, his collaborator, why don't you draw the story? And he said, graphic novel kya hota hai? You know, so we need to get more writers to write and readers to read, but also storytellers across mediums to deal with partition stories in their own ways. I think that is a living museum.
Sure. Got a lot of questions. I'll take a few. Shall we go with this lady here first, and then we'll come. Take the mic, please.
Yes. The title, Reimagining Partition, perplexes me a lot. It doesn't say remembering partition. It doesn't say studying partition in greater detail, going into the micro aspects of it. It says reimagining. So I think I would want one of whichever you like to explain this to me. That is number one. And number two, the second question that I want to ask is that what Ghosh has been saying, that we need to have a re-dialogue on it. There was this very charming lady author from Ethiopia also, who said that it is not the immediate generation, it is not the generation next, but next to next generation. Right. That the third generation which is able to see things much more clearly in perspective. So do we have, do we hope, that is the time now, you know, the third generation is just about it. Sure. Like I was a second generation, my son's generation is ready. So do we expect a flood of partition literature? Because there has been far too little partition literature than it should be. Given the magnitude of the event, I think there is very little written. So do you expect that there could be this type of thing?
I think it's happening as we speak. I mean, but you're right. No, absolutely.
No, but you know, the fact that, you know, we have to also deal with the form of literature. I mean, there's so much available online now. I mean, this whole Citizens Archive and the India initiative, I mean, they're putting it up online. So, you know, there are these stories that are being documented up there. The reason we said restoring partition or reimagining partition is from the third generation perspective, and not from, yeah.
Yes, the lady in the middle. Sure. I'll just come. Yeah, she's there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Some of the speakers touched on this, but I'm very curious to know what, if any, official response to partition came from the newly independent government of India. Was it something that they attempted to grapple with within the capacities that they have, or was it generally something that they felt overwhelmed by? Because I think this is quite significant in terms of how the current state might feel able to address some of these consequences.
No, I think the Indian state responded in some ways that were really admirable. There was a huge relief operation set up, which was unprecedented given that they had no experience of it. The responses on the question of rape I've mentioned, they formed treaties, etc., and there were a whole lot of others. But I think the difficulty was dealing with the psychological consequences and recognizing the shadowy part of the narrative of the nation coming into its own.
Just as she mentioned, I think there is, do you feel there is a need for the government to sensitize people from other part of India more with regards to partition? I'm saying this because I come from Maharashtra, where 47 or even 71 were just moments of victory. I mean, that's a very naive understanding. The reason why I'm asking is, if policymakers or people at the helm of central government in India come from these places, how far are they able to deal sensitively with Pakistan or Bangladesh in this context?
You know, it's a very interesting question because yes, partition is a very Lahore, Dhaka, Delhi kind of a thing. But there's a huge amount of partition that also suffered in Bombay, which gets undocumented. If you look at it, the 50s film industry, it's full of partition. I mean, I can go on with the names, but we know all the names. You know, it's full of partition. The Punjabi lot from Lahore and Karachi were dominating the film industry, and there's this very incident that Lata Mangeshkar talks about, that when she was introduced to Dilip Kumar, and Dilip Kumar said, "To aap kahan ki hai?" So she said, "Main Maharashtra ki hu." So he turned to the music director. She said, "Gaati to अच्छा है, लेकिन इनकी pronunciation बहुत मराठियों की बहुत दाल भात होती है." You know, and Lata felt really bad, and she went to Ghulam Haider, and Ghulam Haider put her through Urdu tuitions. So, you know, it's not something that can be put in denial. The thing was overwhelming, and yes, school book penetration is something that, intervention is something that really needs to be thought about.
The entire shape of Bombay and cities around changed because of partition. In terms of commerce, in terms of education, the whole of Gujarat along the coastline with Kutch and Banni and all those places, and the influx of Sindhis into Gujarat, it's transformed it. In the northeast, the whole shape of Assam changed, Tripura changed. So it's not really only that, and that's the reimagining of it or reimaging. We have to look at all those dimensions.
I have a question that goes into the conspiracy side. So with the climate crisis coming, in the next few decades, we're going to see a lot of immigrants coming from Bangladesh into India with water issue, from Pakistan coming, and going into South India, which is a region that hasn't dealt with these issues as much as North India. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your research into history can tell us about the future.
That's a very interesting question. Pakistan and Bangladesh, there's a German Watch report that puts Pakistan at number 3 on the list of countries most vulnerable to climate change. And this is because there have been 3 floods in the last 4 years. So clearly climate change is a serious problem. Climate change will affect Pakistan, but the climate refugees that you're speaking of is not really something that's spoken of in the climate policy making circles that I've heard of. I understand, and I have spoken to people from Bangladesh, where climate change is almost a security concern. They do understand that there is going to be climate refugees, and they are trying to lobby the international community to recognize climate refugees, just like political refugees or other asylum seekers. And Ayub Qutub Saab, who's an environmentalist in Islamabad, once summarized the Bengali position on climate change to me very succinctly, which is, give me my rice or I will eat your map, damn it.
I'm going to take one question and maybe one more, and I'll have to stop the. Yeah, please.
I deal a lot with migrants still coming from the Sindh parts, who chose to remain in Pakistan when the partition happened. But now, they've come over a long period of time, more than 2 lakh families, in huge numbers, and of course there's this whole question of citizenship. So I really think my point about raising this question is the kind of trauma that people are still suffering, although it's so many years, since 66 years, but still the trauma that people are suffering. And the new generation, see, that generation chose to be there. They decided, the Sindhi, the certain communities decided to continue to be there. But today, some of them are deciding to come away through a lot of trauma. Now, this documentation did not happen. It's not on that side also. The whole partition stories is actually very, very Punjab dominated on both sides. I really think, to be honest, we've got to do stories of that side and this side. Those who chose to stay on but are coming now. Because now there is a total distortion happening. So every time I go to Pakistan and visit those areas, because my work takes me there, one wants to reclaim. So I really think there is a suggestion being put across. Would the archives or the museum also capture some of these positive stories? You choose to stay, you choose to be a minority with respect, but now that whole thing changes.
Kavita, in this side, that side, I'm pegging the book here, but we have the story from Gujarat of this, of a lady who's now living in Kutch. It's a story, and she is living in Adigram in Pakistan, and she says India claimed us, and then they had to move. So there's a lot of these young generation stories that are there of the Hindus in Pakistan who are living there and who've chose to live there. But those are the stories that are being discussed. It's not that they're ignored. It's yes, in the larger backdrop where it's overwhelming Punjab and overwhelming Dhaka, there might be footnotes, but the fact remains the stories are there and they must be documented in society.
I think this is a continuing story.
We'll in touch after the session, so I'll take the details for the archive.
Thank you very much. This is obviously going to be a sort of continuing subject. Thank you, Urvashi. Thank you, Rafael. Thank you, Vishnu.